There have been a lot of headlines recently about population. China's is falling.
For the first time in more than 60 years, China's population has fallen.
India's is booming.
It's expected to overtake China to become the world's most populous country.
And Japan's is getting older.
The declining birth rate is putting the future of the country at risk.
None of these are new problems. Population anxiety has been around for a long time, and it links to a lot of our other political anxieties. When we start talking about population, it's not long before we're talking about housing, robots taking our jobs, or climate change. Today, I want to tackle the population question head on. How is the world's population changing and what does it mean? To start with, we can basically separate the world into two buckets. First, there are developing countries, where the population is booming and getting younger. Then there are developed countries like Australia, where the population is stagnating and getting older. It's not quite as simple a split as this. China, for example, is kind of a hybrid of the two. But it is a striking pattern, which we can see if we look at countries by their median age. That is, if you line up the youngest person to the oldest person, what is the age of the person in the middle? And in Nigeria, where the population is growing rapidly, it's about 19 years old. In India, it's 29. Australia, about 39. And Japan, 49. These are quite striking differences. So what's driving these trends, and what do they mean for the countries that are going through them? The short answer is that both of these stories actually begin with a story of success, with rising living standards, but they pose new and difficult challenges for countries in both categories. Let's start with developed countries. People in wealthy countries like Australia are living longer because of better access to healthcare. They're also choosing to have fewer children. But this can create a challenge when it gives us a bit of a population imbalance. In 1975, there were 7 working age people for every retiree in Australia. Now that 7 has fallen to 4, and it's expected to keep falling in future. That puts some strain on the way that our societies are set up. We have an expectation that you work through your working life and you pay your taxes. And then in old age, society takes care of you through things like the government-funded pension, or superannuation, or aged care. But now we have more old people relying on those services. We can already see the strain that's putting on things like aged care. And at the same time, we have fewer young people to fund it through their taxes, a significant financial burden on the shoulders of the same young people who are also struggling to access housing and struggling to compete in the jobs market. What that means is that on the one hand, we're struggling to provide enough of a standard of care for older Australians, and we're putting a burden on the shoulders of younger Australians, a pretty significant challenge, and one of the biggest ones facing Australian governments over the next few years. Now let's turn to the developing world, and again, there's a story of success. In the last few decades, significant development progress has been made, improving living standards and pulling more than 1 billion people out of poverty. That means that people are living healthier lives and having healthier children. But this boom also comes with challenges. How can developing countries ensure they have the systems in place to support larger and larger populations? In general, developing countries find it harder than wealthy countries to raise taxes from their citizens. And it's harder for them to borrow money internationally as well. What that means is that a lot of developing countries don't have healthcare systems or welfare systems that are as advanced as the ones that we're used to in wealthier countries. Finding a way to overcome that is a really significant challenge for the global community. Now let's turn to China, where we see a little bit of both of these things at once. Starting in the 1960s, China had a massive population boom. It lifted living standards, but it worried authorities who weren't sure whether they could continue to support such a large population. Their response was a decades-long one-child policy. Now that policy had significant human rights concerns, but it also backfired. Fewer children in China accelerated the ageing process, which means now China is facing the same sort of problem as Australia. But it's happening at a time when China's health system and welfare system are not as well developed. That's a really significant problem for China, but it's also a bit of a cautionary tale. When we look through the history of governments that have tried to change population trends, we see this story a lot. According to the UN's chief population expert, attempts to shift population trends are usually ineffective and even dangerous. They can lead to things like forced sterilisation campaigns or restricted access to contraception. That's why the UN and governments like Australia are far more focused on how to adapt to these trends than how to change them. To see how we can apply all of that to the real world, I want to finish by talking about the impact of population on perhaps the greatest issue of all, climate change. It's quite common to link population concerns to climate concerns, but the majority of emissions in all of human history come from a very small percentage of the population, people in the wealthiest countries. That suggests that we should focus not just on how many of us there are, but the way in which we consume. Shifting that in the developed world is a significant challenge for us. It's also a challenge in the developing world too. The global community needs to find a way to support development without developing countries relying on fossil fuels like we did, because that's something the planet can't afford. That is going to require careful thinking and practical solutions.